Kia ora tātou. Kia rangi, kia papa, tēnā kōrua. Ki ngā rangatira o te kaupapa nei. Peter, Rick, Glenn, Britt, where are you? And nā kai mahi o tēnei kaupapa. Kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Ka nui te mihi anō ki te kaupapa nei. Kia puta hei ora o ngā tangata, o ngā whenua, o te ao. Anō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I was thinking maybe not to do any translation, but after Dave's sort of mentioning, I thought and also after receiving all the blessings from Uncle Max and Dean, the first acknowledgement in that mihi is to grandfather, son, and mother, earth, Parangi and Papa Tuanuku. So it's the same sort of structure, the same recognition of those two critical elements of our planet, of our existence, in Māori as in what Uncle Max was sharing with us. And I've personally found that a real treat, a really great thing to have them here and the way they've been integrated into this program and the way they've connected us up together and oriented us to the natural world and inhabiting that. And so the other part that I said in the little mihi was, and this is a beautiful structure of Māori mihi whakatau, is what's the purpose? What's the purpose here? So, and because my language is quite small, I said the purpose was the upspringing of well-being for the people and for the land, for the whenua. So, and that's a really strong theme that I feel like is coming through the conference so far, and I feel just very privileged to be here. So, thank you, and thank you, Lindsay, for all of that. So, just a little bit of background to help understand a little bit better about what I've done and what we're doing in our practice, and in relation to this kaupapa, this purpose of responsibility. Going back a little bit, this project here is called Bodhinyana and it's a Buddhist monastery at the end of the suburban valley in Wellington, of all places, and it's a spiritual home to the immigrant community from Southeast Asian countries like Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, all the DEERUBBIN countries. And when I was at architecture school and a little bit after, I had a sort of a strong desire to understand some of the deeper questions which were bothering me or I was asking about life. So I ended up going to Southeast Asia and through India and spending a year over there, and I went to monasteries and I did meditation retreats, mainly in the Buddhist tradition. And when I came back to Wellington, I found that there were these monks of the same monastery order that I'd stayed at in eastern Thailand. And they were Westerners that had a real keen interest, a bit like me, they came from Canada and England and Kiwis. And they had taken the robes, and so I ended up sitting with meditation with them. And then, because I was a young architect graduate, I got to design and end up building this monastery there, which looks like this. And this is like 30 years old now. So it was an amazing first project. Because also I had stopped architecture school halfway through for a couple of years and sort of learnt how to build. And I had a little construction company with a friend, which was called 425 Construction, because that's what we got paid an hour. And so this was this opportunity to sort of, on this project, I was the architect, the QS, for better or worse, the project manager, the site foreman, and was wearing all those hats and sort of lived there for a year making this building happen. And it's a series of deepening enclosures from an outer courtyard and into a cloister and then into the main sala or meditation hall. And those are both 12 metres square, and the cloister gets covered with a marquee from a central pole on those days when you've got to make it bigger to house the whole community when they would come. So it's kind of got actually quite a lot of influence from Japanese and Chinese architecture, but it was accessible to me. I found those sort of Buddhist traditions more beautiful than the sort of more Gothic sort of Thai, Burmese sort of traditions. And also they were more accessible because it's stick building, basically. We could build this with sticks in the way you do here, I think, pretty much a lot similar in us. So it's got like 8x2 studs at 600 centres, and you can see that here, lifting the frames. This is me 30 years ago, and the monks on the corner. It's a beautiful setting, and that was a lovely project. And so then I was sort of in practice for 15 years doing mainly education in houses, and like here, young architects can access really cool projects in terms of residential work, and we've also got amazing settings. So these are running in lines across here, and these are the one in the Bay of Plenty, there's one right up in Northland, which is sort of closest we get to a Sydney kind of Brisbane climate. And then the Marlborough Sound's a very, very isolated place where it's so hard to take workers out there and expensive that we pre-made these elements, and it became all about weight. And we got the biggest helicopter that we could find, a log lifting Russian one, to bring out these modules. And interestingly, we tied a tree under here because if the downdraft from the chopper wind adds about half a tonne of load on the load. So by having the tree, it makes it sort of sit back, and they needed a bit of wind. So, I mean, these are probably challenges that many Australian architects face as well in terms of how to think about pre-making things, how to decrease site time and work with remote locations. There's another little series here, a sort of quite a well-endowed house. And what I started to develop was this idea of wanting to give some poetic expression to place, to really sort of ground the project in place. And so this is on a beautiful estuary at the top of the South Island near Nelson, and there's a bird, an oyster catcher, black oyster catcher called a toria pango. So the theme of the building just became about nestling on these terraces we made with a wonderful friend of mine, Megan Raitt, who's an Australian-trained landscape architect, and so there's the sort of folded wingtips and the orange beak and the orange legs. And another project for the same client, the house is further back in the background on that image, which is a studio made out of CLT, all triangulated, and kind of he was an interesting client. He said, "Oh, I want you to do me a studio now." And so I did something. He said, it's not very ambitious. It's not quite as, you're not pushing the boat out. So he wanted to be, which was a wonderful provocation to get from a client, to be asking you to be, to do something different. And then this one, which was on Grand Designs, which is a friend of Dave's and mine, is Chris Moller. Was the guy that fronts Grand Designs New Zealand, it's a very remote place in the Kenepuru Sound and Marlborough Sounds, and so we built, had the builder build these modules in his workshop, which was about 2 hours down a windy road, but near the main road where the men could be in the workshop and build these elements. And the clients had said we wanted a curved house, and the architects go, a curved house, something expensive, and so we ended up just arraying those in a slight curve. So each one of these wedges is narrow at the back and wider at the front, and fixed glass, and then just ventilated panels. So that was a great grand design show because there was a fire in the PV generator shed. The client broke his ankle. They were running out of money. There was, all of the drama that TV requires, to be a good show. And then, so here we are at the moment. This is our office in Wellington, and the tall guy in the middle is Ewan, my business partner, and the smiley guy in the back, he's our associate, Kevin, and our great team. And we're doing, like in New Zealand, you have to be a bit of a jack of all trades. It's a small economy. It's the economy the size of Melbourne, there's only 4.5 million people. And actually, all the construction materials businesses are owned by Australians, all the banks are Australian. And so everything's kind of a bit expensive. And so we have to sort of try and work with sometimes pretty limited means. But we're doing some bigger commercial stuff with some commercial property people up here, which is sort of interesting to be doing something taller than 2 stories. And this was a project we did a few years ago, which is a much enjoyed building near the airport, a big sports centre. And again, sort of in terms of the architectural process of trying to ground the project in sight, and this was one in a competition, I found a little shell on the beach here. There's actually a road in the foreground. And just sort of, it's an amazing process, isn't it? The architectural process where you can just take a tiny little idea and make large, and just using this process of drawing and creating. So it's a privileged role we have. And the thing with that building was we wanted to make it naturally ventilated, naturally lit, and to have a clear impression of being a public sports facility, and so that it breathes as the people inside it breathe. So in between all these panels are activated louvers. And another sports-related building, which is bowls, a bowls building, which is a couple of years old. But what I sort of thought was I'd take the opportunity to share with you at this place and time is the stuff that we've been doing with Māori World, Te Ao Māori. And I'm not Māori. And the first project we got, I hadn't really had much contact. I was just a suburban kind of upbringing with Māori people in their settings and in their the way they organise themselves. Obviously, knew Māori people, but not in terms of as a sort of a collective endeavour. And the first project was a school, which is actually it's a really interesting school because it had a kohanga reo, which is a preschool, and kura kopapa Māori, which is a primary school, and a wharikura, which is a secondary school, all under one roof. And you would go in there, maybe a nursery age, as under 1 year old, and you would come out at 17, and you're always under this one roof. And so we had this idea of having a roof that sort of traced the journey, as it were, and also the supporting cloak of the mātua, of the elders, of the parents and the teachers. The thing about this community, it was really hard out. If you go to this kura, one of your parents has to speak Te Reo Māori only all the time. So it demands, so this is about saving the language. So about probably in the 80s, mid-80s, Te Reo Māori was basically in absolute critical care. It was a dying language. And people started to realise that, Māori did, and organise themselves and try and get funding. And these guys started off as a preschool, and one of the recent Maori language commissioners said, the Maori language is out of critical care, but it's not out of hospital yet. So what it means is that if you're a family there, and also you couldn't have a sibling going to another school, you had to have both siblings at the school, and one of the parents always speaking through our Maori at the football ground, at the movies. So that was a way of them saying, this is so important, we're going to have to make it sort of really mandatory and make a big commitment. And this is sort of the sketching around a couple of courtyards. That's the Kohanga Reo, which is the preschool. And there were some recycled buildings on the site that we moved, and used to be a polytech. And then the other, and it's quite small, maybe only 80, 90 students. And then they wanted to be transparent to the people of Palmerston North. So we put a big glass front and didn't do a marae with the post, because it's not a marae. A marae is a particular thing in Māoridom. It represents tipuna, ancestors. It represents families and the past, the lineage. And this was about being across a number of iwi tribes and drawing the tamariki, the children, in. And then we also, and this is the thing that I've found very important, we worked with Māori artists and artisans so that they could also be the cultural advisors, so that we could learn what when we were crossing the tikanga, we were crossing and not supporting the way things are done or need to be done, or crossing it in some way. So we had a really cool artist, Bob Yankee, and we developed this idea of these columns. And then he worked at Massey University in the Māori department and had some of his students do these aluminium panels. And the other thing about this project is that it actually had quite fluid space, and now the whole of the Ministry of Education over the whole country is sort of almost saying that everyone now has to have this fluid open space, innovative learning environments. So that's very common. And then in the preschool we had this idea, kohanga actually means nest, so kohanga reo means language nest, and we sort of made a literal nest. And one of the parents at that kura is from an amazing family of Māori in near Palmerston North. His dad is Māori academic, and his mum was also a professor. His uncle's a High Court judge, and he is now the head of Māori studies at Massey, but he had this idea at the Wānanga in Otaki, which is closer to Wellington, to build a facility that addressed the physical issues that Māori faced. Lack of fitness, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, smoking, poor nutrition, and all of these kind of things. And address them in a university setting, because people would come and learn here. And so we were asked to design a building that had a couple of sports courts, like proper, with a sprung floor like this, and a series of different purposes, a weights gym, teaching kitchen, teaching spaces, and a common area. And then we introduced this thing, which is a seed or a kākano. And so that ended up being the plan, and I've got a little series of slides that should play. And so we ended up using this concept of te wharitapa, the four sides of the house, which is what Meihana's father, Mason, who was the Māori psychiatrist, and he came up with this model for Māori health, which is taha tinana, which is the physical well-being, taha wairua, so that's your spiritual well-being, taha whānau, that's your collective, your family and your group, your community, and taha hininaro, which is mental and emotional. And so if any of those things are not in place, you're not going to have well-being. And now that's actually been adopted as the whole nation's general health model. And so we kind of, rather than having 4 sides of the house, we actually did 4 houses. And there's a weights gym is in here, the classrooms are in there. This thing became the symbol of the Wairua and the place for it. And the whānau is the collective. So this is, it's one of those problems where you've got a very big box like a warehouse design and you've got to add the human stuff to it. So we ended up with this folded roof. And then this is the whakatauki or proverb that underlies the wānanga. So that's what they, e kore o I ngaro, he kākano I rui mai Rangiatea, which means I will never be lost. The seed was sown in Rangiatea, Rangiatea being the ancestral homelands, Hawaii, from Polynesia nearly 1,000 years ago when Māori immigrated. And the seed is talking about the tikanga, all the knowledge. You know, this is the thing that's so precious for Māori is to maintain that. So we decided to build a seed, and people had, in the briefing had said they wanted a place where they could be quiet. So that's the folded roofs, and then we built this rather quizzical thing, which has got an interior, and it's all sound insulated and displacement air. And so people come when they're first introduced to the building or to work there or to come and visit, and they go in there and they get taught about the purpose of the place, or they can go in there and so it's an interesting juxtaposition between the very active purpose of the building and this reflective space. Internally, it's tilt panels, a big box that's about 40 by 40 and about 8 metres high for the netball. And our champion team, the Pulse, that's their home. And they've got Te Wananga o Raukawa on their livery. So that's really great. And then the other thing that Māori love in their whare, their traditional whare, is a tāhuhu, which is the ridge beam. It's got a lot of meaning. It represents the backbone. So we did this big sort of waka-inspired beam to span across the space. And just across the road, we've just completed another project for the wānanga. And basically, this whole thing was built or cobbled together around an old school with old recycled buildings in the 80s. In the 80s, when the elders realised that their kids didn't know the tikanga, they didn't know te reo Māori, and they were thinking, we've got to do something. And for many years, they didn't receive any funding, and they had to just cobble together with real basic stuff. And they had a little bit of land, and we'll come to the land issue in a minute. And so we've done this one, and then we got this opportunity to do this university building, which was to have a library, a lecture theatre, and a student hub. And that's the wharekai, which is where the food is, and everyone eats together. And you can see that the whole interior of the campus is full of cars. Isn't that great? And so we've been working to master plan that out to try and get the cars away from being the centre of the public space of the campus. And this was the first project we could do that. And this is another kura here. So in this town, it's a really Māori town. It's great. You can go into the shops and people are speaking te reo Māori. And there are three kura and 3 kohanga reo and the university. And the concept for this was one that came much easier than the other one. And there's this lovely myth around tāwhaki going to the heavens and bringing back the baskets of knowledge, these 3 baskets of knowledge. And so it just worked very, very nicely with the program that the Kite Ururu Mātua, which is where the basket of knowledge is around peaceful pursuits, quietness of the soul, all good things for love for one another. So we sort of made that the library. And then Urururangi which is the knowledge of the really sort of essential creation myths and sacred ritual, and that kind of highly ritualized space. And so that's where we put the lecture theatre with its carvings. They had a set of carvings that had been in a container for 20 years that a master carver had done, and they never had built a home for it. And so we proposed that we would put those inside the main space and put what's called the maho, the porch, in behind glass because you couldn't put it in the town because then you'd be creating another marae, and there already were marae in the town, and that would be disrespectful to those marae. So it's not a marae, it's a set of marae-like carvings, but they're protected in this glass case. And then the other part is the knowledge that relates to stone, cultivation, soil, other work, and sort of more the daytime activities, food gathering. And so we related that to the knowledge that the students were gathering, and this was their sort of home in the hub. It's like, again, you've got a big box with the lecture theatre, displacement area, courtyard in the middle, and these two sort of saddlebags. That's the plan. Whare puka puka, books, lecture theatre, staff, the hub there, and then the sort of student services. And then to sort of, the akite means a basket, and so this is actually, so this is the main space. You can see there are these carvings. And all of these paired ones on the side represent every marae up and down the coast, from Porirua right up to past Palmerston North. And so this is a real power room for local Māori. They go in there and they can see their ancestors, they can see their own marae, and they're all collected together. So it's a really special thing that's been created. It's the library side and the courtyard. And the different patterns work well with the purposes or the basket. So this is the potama pattern for the books, which is the pursuit of knowledge. And then that's the main sort of front, and so that entrance is used mainly on ceremonial occasions, and it becomes the lobby of the lecture theatre, and you go into the lecture theatre there. So, one of the lovely things about these projects is that they have a good impact, a really good impact on the community, broadly and specifically. And then we were asked to do 2 projects in Te Irawera, which is in this part of the North Island, and it's the most remote, wildest part of the North Island. Very big podocarp trees, remus, matais, a very big area, very steep-sided, quite inaccessible. There's one road through it. And the tribe that lives there is called Ngāi Tūhoi, and they are fiercely independent. They often say, the story goes, if you go to Tūhoi country, you might get eaten. And so you made it back okay. And then this document is the Māori version. No, it's the Pākehā version of the Treaty of Waitangi. So this is the founding document in New Zealand in 1840. I think that the people that were coming out from England had realised that there's quite a lot of carnage around with the colonialisation, and so they tried to treat the Māori people in a slightly better way rather than just a straight-out invasion and slaughter. And they actually created a document. It was mainly driven by churchmen. And they created a document and negotiated with the Maori leaders, and the document went around the country, not everywhere. And it basically said, well, you have the rights to your waters, you have the rights to your lands, and you have the rights to your own self-authority. That's what the Maori version said. The English version said something different. The translations were different. Anyway, that sits there in the history of our country. And as the colonial pressure came on, and the businessmen that had created the New Zealand company that had pre-sold all this land that they didn't even own, and all the people started flooding in from the UK and settlers, and they were arriving and they couldn't access land, the pressure really came on to get the land for Māori people. And so the result of that was just decades of injustice, confiscation, war, sort of pressurising to buy land so that it was actually bought, but the consequence if they didn't would be far worse, and that kind of thing. The same thing happened to Tūhoe. They actually got most of their land confiscated because a missionary was killed by another tribe and they were blamed for it. And it was these kind of techniques that were used by the Crown at the time and with the business people behind them. Because of that treaty, when Māori people started to finally fight back in a sort of a public way in the 80s, a tribunal was set up and there was lots of land marches and protesting, and a tribunal was set up that basically looked into the history of all of the land sales. And what would come out of that would be a deed of settlement. And for Tūhoe, they had been repeatedly betrayed. They'd actually been promised a whole lot of things and they never happened because the politicians would really get it when they went up there, and when they got back to Wellington, they would just forget about it because all the people would say, you can't do that, you can't do that. And that was going on right with John Key until 2010. So anyway, finally in 2013 with Tūhoe, there was a settlement. And so their land, this was what their traditional area was. And all of that was where their food basket was, connection to the sea and very arable river flats. And all of that was, most of it was confiscated right back to Ruatoki line. And then in 1954, they had all of their forests taken from them with no consultation to turn it into a national park. And they had no involvement in that, and they couldn't go and hunt in there, they couldn't go and dwell in there. They could do some hunting, but not for their traditional things. There was lots of other rather dark episodes with, there was a prophet, Ruakenina, who built this amazing building, way, way up. I haven't been up there, it's really, really remote. And people were gathering there and had quite a strong settlement. They were doing no harm to anyone. And the Crown went in there and basically arrested, they shot a couple of people, one of which was his son. And then they arrested and they burnt. And this had happened before. Burned him, and Rua was cleared of all charges except one called some ridiculous charge around, I can't actually remember, but he was put in prison for a little while. But the effect of that was pretty much the decimation of the community. So Tūhoe, this guy, amazing man, Tamati Kruger, he's their negotiator. And this is their CEO, Kirsty. She's a trained lawyer. He went to university and then went back and lived and learned their traditional ways and has been an amazing fighter for the people. They want us to do two projects. One was a town centre, hardly a town, it's a small settlement of 300 people, and a visitor centre on this beautiful lake. And this is actually a photo from a friend of mine from the 70s driving through Ruatahuna and the kids coming out and when his car broke down and overheated. And the lake, the project on the lake, they were really interesting to work with because they didn't actually say specifically what they wanted. And when I'd say, tell me your stories and let me know what you're thinking about, and that it was hard to get those things. It was more about just being there, soaking it in, and then they had some trust that we would do something, and it was sort of just a process of a relationship and just feeling your way through. And I had responded to these amazing, there was a story about the creation of the lake which involved a taniwha. So I had this idea of using these extraordinary stones, which I'll show you an image of in a minute, which had fallen down in the geological event that created the lake, these big sandstone slabs, and then have the image of this family that was in the story, in the myth. And they said, oh no, you can't have a taniwha represented. It's a bit like in Islam, you can't represent God or Muhammad. And so these are the things that you'd try them and then I'd learn some things more. And so these are these sandstone slabs. They're literally just about parallel, and these ones have fallen down and landed vertically, these remnant slabs. And there's beautiful things like that happening on this river. So Tūhoe carving. So we created this visitor centre, which is really essentially a room with a tribal office behind it. And there are these precast elements that have been clad with burnt wood, and this represents ahika, or the home fires. And for Tūhoe, this is an amazing moment because they are coming back and existing on the lake. I forgot to say what actually happened in the settlement here was a brilliant thing where there was a lot of argument about who would own Te Urewera. Tūhoe did not want it to be a national park anymore and did not want to be relegated from it. The Crown had realised that that was what needed to happen to give it back to them. But when they would go back down to the South Island to the farmers and their constituents, they say, you can't give the Maoris a national park. National park belongs to everyone. You can't give it back to them. You can't give it to the Maoris. And so the minister and Tamati came up with this idea that no one would own it. And it became an entity, like a person. And it's not owned by anyone, which is the natural state of things. And the same with the Whanganui River now, and other places. Indigenous peoples from around the world are looking to use this model as a way of resolving some of these tensions. So basically, the Crown at the moment, through DOC, the Department of Conservation, and Tūhoe, steward the looking after of Te Urewera, which is thousands and thousands of hectares of this sort of forest. And eventually, as Tūhoe become more skilled at managing it, they will take over the entire composition of the board, which runs it, probably with some small DOC component. So it's a really, really great model that diffused all of the tension and allowed them to come back into this area. And this is the sort of sequence of spaces with whakaeke, which is where you do your porphyry and you're welcoming through these gates, which act like the traditional gates. The whenua space where actually it sort of all got blended up into sort of one kind of thing where the rangatiratanga, which is about the elders, and the kaitiakitanga, which is about the stewardship of the environment, are all together in one space. The manakitanga means hospitality and looking after each other. And then you've got your business end, wharepaku toilets, rest zones, and basically big verandas where the trampers, because there's a national park, there's a great walk around the lake, and so this becomes the place where people start and end their walk. And just on that other slide was just how we did cassette flooring, the precast elements came in, and other normal elements, but a lot of pre-making of things. And the roof form was generated just by having a shorter leg on portals in the middle. It rains an awful lot. Tūhoe are called the children of the mist. And so a lot of the time there's a lot of rain and this animates and comes down through these cables. And this frieze is sort of representative of the Ngāhere, the forest, and it's fitted on cables, so in the wind it sort of billows around. And then these are A2, they're the occupation, they're saying, we're here, we're back, this is our place. And on there is their pepiha, their Tūhoe te iwi, panakiri te maunga. So and that's the traditional structure of a talk, how you introduce yourself. Yeah, there was also a really interesting architectural moment with the architectural community because this floor was the roof of a John Scott building that was built by the Department of Lands and Surveys in the 70s, 5 kilometres away, and Tūhoe didn't want it. It had actually been closed. It needed a lot of money spent on it. And the Department of Conservation didn't want it, but the architectural community, including Nick, who's, my good friend who is a great lover of John Scott, as all New Zealand architects are, because his wonderful work. Sort of New Zealand's leading Māori architect who's died, and he did Fortuna Chapel. So there was this really interesting sort of moment where the architectural world got drawn right in to Māori land rights, to the changing nature of the country, to different sensibilities. And there was a fight to save the building. The building wasn't saved, but Tūhoe wanted to use parts of it. So all of the floor is from the ceiling, the handrails are all from there, and other elements were used. And having worked with them, I could really understand, although I tried to talk them out of it, and just my role of being their architect. But at a certain point, after trying 3 times, I was told to stop that kind of conversation. And so, in a way, they had never had any self-authority in that area, and now they finally have. And this is what they wanted to do, because they didn't want to spend the money on it. And actually, it represented a lot of pain. And the stories from the kuia, the elderly woman, about what it was like when that building was being built and how the Māori were treated. So they're wanting to build for themselves. Tūhoe also are incredibly values-driven, more than any other clients I've had. And they have run the Living Building Challenge through the first building that we didn't do with Jasmax. And those 2 projects I've just shown you have been done not completely to the Living Building Challenge, because it just didn't make sense in many ways because of the lake being a battery and already waste systems. But all of the materials, there's no redless materials, which is what happens in, there are 7 petals. Many of you may know about the Living Building Challenge, but so other than the water and the energy, we basically complied to all of the other petals. And this is our tracking sheet for the redless material. So every material in the building is analysed by Caitlin, who's a fantastic researcher in our office. And she will call Russia, Germany, Spain, Auckland, Invercargill, and ask the companies that are making things, what's in your product? Oh no, you can't have that. That's IP, that's our recipe. And she said, well, you won't get used in our projects, and these are becoming more important things, and we'll let people know that you don't, So there's this whole sort of conversation that happens. It takes ages. Every single one of these lines represents sometimes up to 5 or 10 hours of work to find out what's in and to make sure there's no, of the 31 redless materials, there are 770 CAS numbers of the different isotopes of those materials. So it's incredibly technical, incredibly complex, and a huge work. But at the end of it, you know that you've got a completely redless-free building, This is Ruatahuna, and it's got 350 people. It's in the middle of Te Urawera, and it was a forestry area by Fletcher florists. And so it's got Māori farms. There was a general store which closed a few years ago, and there was petrol over the different decades coming in to Ruatahuna for the locals. But there hasn't been any gas pumped in that area for about 18 years. And it means that people would drive a quarter of a tank to fill up, drive back, and to go out of the forest. So we were asked to do this thing they called it a town hub. We ended up with this idea of the general store, a rural store, gas, visitors accommodation, tribal office, and then a cover in between. And so this becomes the town square. And Tūhoe consider themselves to be the offspring of Pinipu Koharangi, who's the mist maiden, and Tamonga, who's the male, the mountain, and which is sort of a bit of an inversion of Rangi and Papatūānuku, but that's the way it is. And so I just had this idea of these are the earthen type buildings with just dark steel and this sort of more lacy roof. And so the idea of that is that if you're going into either building, you animate that this sort of square, and so it comes alive. And it was up here, the hall, the store, and people would drive through the town, and they would think, oh, I just need an ice cream or a coffee, and then before they'd realise they wanted that, they'd pass and they think, oh, I'll just keep going. So our main move was to take this and put it right down on the road. There are a lot of horses in this town, people with a lot of horseback. So we've got places to tie up horses. And the other thing that happened before was that it had stock fences everywhere down here. And no one could move around because you had to climb stiles all the time because they would drive sheep from one place to another. It's too far to bring a stock truck. And so just that sort of simple move of taking the fences out, it's really like going back to an old general store from the days of horse and cart and putting it right on the road and trying to slow the road down. Working this with Megan, and she wanted to put a tree in the middle of the road. But it's a little bit hard when you do have the stock trucks coming through. And so that's been made. They ended up actually employing all their own people. We were sort of down the chain of control or command, as it were. No, in terms of they would ask us our opinion, but if it didn't, if they wanted to do something different, they would. And so there were a lot of things that didn't quite happen, but it's worked amazingly well, and they sort of subsidise the burgers and the output from the cafe, and it's become a real hubs town centre. And people that were working there were very skilled, but they didn't have work. So by the time the building had finished, there were a lot of new cars in town. Things were getting fixed up. There's a kaumatua, and so it's pretty simple, straightforward stuff, but it makes a big difference. Another really interesting project, which is, 2 minutes left? Yeah. It's just in New Plymouth, which is a place where there was a lot of wars and really a pretty ugly past. It didn't happen everywhere like that, but it did particularly here. The Anglican Church, just run through these. We're strengthening this building that's been closed. It's it's New Zealand's oldest stone church, this building. This was a 90s edition. There's a vicarage that we're moving from here down to here, and we're making this thing called a whare hononga, which is a peace and reconciliation building. And it's on an angle because we're not interested in the grid of the town. We're interested in the pathways the Māori had from the hill behind here down to their kaimoana and their important headlands. And this project is that's the church. And we've adopted this sort of lattice structure using two types of alveol and glulam of different colours. So this is about two peoples coming together to reconcile the past. And we use this waharua kōpito pattern, which is diamonds on diamonds, which represents a point where people and events cross. So this is a traditional Māori tāniko weaving pattern. And this is just the very initial stuff. We need to calm the light down to be an exhibition space. But that's kind of, in this most historical, this was a garrison church, and there are no Māori until recently buried in the graveyard. And there was a Māori deacon who said, I want to be buried here, not in his home place. And his family didn't want that, but he insisted so that he would be the first Māori to be buried in this military graveyard. So that's an act of saying, it's time we put aside these differences. And this is actually going to tell the story of Ngāti Te Whiti, who are the local tangata whenua underneath this town. And they don't even have a marae, they've just been so hammered in the past. So it's a very cool project in terms of its purpose. Actually, how much time have I got? 5? Yeah. I'll just blast through this. This is not a Māori project, it's a high-end yoga retreat, but it's super sustainable. Down in Glenorchy. And it's got a lot of permaculture and every manner of energy production. Lots of... Yeah, oh, there's one more. Yeah, like the kind of key concepts here were to build buildings that were more rooted in the landscape. So these plastic parts and the wooden parts are more about the glaciation, and then the buildings are more like the rock outcrops of the schist, which is worn down by glaciation. There's big water systems here from a massive thermal hot water, solar power, microhydro from a burn or a creek, all the food production. That's the main entry building. This is the main space, which looks across at the most settled part of the view. Very nice, $6,000 a week. And finally, which is sort of a coming together of these things, a university building which is for the marae. This is the marae here at the university above Wellington, Victoria. And it's a very narrow site. There's a lot of the campus in the city. It's a great site. It looks out over. But the marae is quite well hidden behind these old villas. And this is called a waharoa, or gateway. And we organised this walkway in So that's the scene in behind the houses. It's tucked in. It's beautiful because it's got this leafy, sort of very secluded, settled feeling. And it's a really important place on the campus now. Just about any visiting academic, anyone coming to work in the university, everyone goes through the marae. They get welcomed in a traditional way. It's become the gateway to the campus, and it's the spiritual heart of the campus. And so finally they've... The university plan had kaitiakitanga, or environmental sustainability, as one of their top priorities, and making the marae the heart of the campus so could finally build a new Māori studies. And so we won this project through a sort of selection process. And this is the ground floor. So this is really serving the marae as a social place and a ritual place where you have a wharikai, which always happens, always food after a ritual engagement, and this can actually get up to 400 people. It's about typically 180, but if you put people out on them, the atea is the outdoor space, which is actually where most of the meeting and greeting and talking occurs. Te tumu here in the waka means the mooring post of the waka, and the whole marae is called Te Here in the Waka, which means the gathering place of the canoes. And and there's a fairly steep street. And then there's only 3 stories, but our key sort of spatial driver was to make a very permeable, connected space, not chopped off and not separated. So it's permeable sort of visually across, but also vertically there's a sort of a main stair that comes up through holes through the building. And it's only 17 metres wide. And this is going to be done to the auspices to be a registered living building project. And the other thing we're trying to do is to make it zero carbon for construction, which is really hard, really challenging on a building of this scale. And so we're working to that end. And so that you can see the section with the main stair, the fall of the street, this engagement room, the eating, kitchen, toilets and plant. And all the piles we're going to do in wood. We're even going to try and do wooden pile caps out of 900 deep LVL, but we're going to end up doing concrete there, but try and get low carbon concrete. You can see the holes to bring the light down and to also do the thermosiphon evacuation of the air. And the whole thing's covered in PVs. The wastewater will go to the neighbouring buildings' toilets. You can see the little whare there. And it's good that it's not 4 stories because it would be a bit overpowering. There are plants on the building to clean the grey water and to evapotranspirate. And food production. And this is sort of initial sort of view. You can see through to the meeting house here, the red. There's a tunnel connecting it to a bridge that crosses the busy road. And the planted screens and a view from the inside, from inside the art house space. And the main structure, which is really interesting structure of rocking frames, and it's basically it's like a Tudor building where you bring the main load, vertical loads down inside the building and use the back span of the cantilevers to extend the span. So rather than having 4 column lines or one bigger ones down the centre, by bringing these 2 in, there's not much load here. And we're looking to do a CLT floor, which is basically not joists and floor panels, but actually laying out these big panels to create voids in between. So there's a whole lot of challenges, innovation and interest in this for us. And then this is our initial carbon calculation on the volume of materials, the embodied carbon, some different options, where we're getting the data from, and whether we can, if it's negative, that means we've succeeded. But the CLT floor, the more wood put in, the more carbon you can hold. So that's looking positive, but we know it's actually going to be really, really hard. But I really appreciated Caroline laying out the challenge that we face in relation to this warming. And yeah, it's deeply concerning, the amount of change we're going to be facing from what I've been reading. So now starting to gather friends together and talking about this more, trying to do this through work. And yeah, I think that it's really important to really see what it is that we turn away from, because it's all quite identifiable, the kinds of denying that we do, I do, around why we don't, take it as seriously as it needs to be taken. And it is a kind of a numbers game, because we've just got, it's really simple as all of this wonderful life that we have, and from our industrialisation based on this amazing power-packed stuff coming out of the ground. But unfortunately, it's got a consequence. That's it. Thank you.